Being here today. I know with everybody's busy schedule, sometimes it's hard to carve out time to come to these things, so I really appreciate you coming. Last year, we began our Student Success Initiative. Actually, last year, this month, in October, we had our Student Success Kickoff at the Gastonia Conference Center, and many of you, maybe all of you were there at that. And you remember sort of what we did, how we began our efforts with Achieving the Dream and Completion by Design. And we're continuing that, as well as of course, the North Carolina Community College system has been continuing those efforts. And we want to welcome Dr. Rob Johnstone here today to talk to us about some of the efforts that have been going on nationally and with the state. And let me just give you a little bit of information about Dr. Johnstone, other than he wears Hawaiian shirts often. Some of you may have seen that already. Dr. Johnstone is the founder and president of the National Center for Inquiry and Improvement, and where he specializes in working with faculty and administrators on data-driven decision-making with policies and procedures to help impact student success. He's been working a lot with completion by design in North Carolina especially, but he's also worked on national efforts with completion by design, as well as the Aspen Prize, Carnegie's Statway and Quantway, which some of you are familiar with, especially the math people, Achieving the Dream, Lumina's Guided Pathways, and Education Trust Access to Success. So a lot of experience in working with student success. Just a little bit about his educational background. He has degrees in psychology and experimental psychology, as well as a PhD in social psychology from the University of Oregon. Go Ducks. He's taught statistics, so a fellow statistics instructor here, and psychology, and he's served as institutional researcher and vice president for instruction at Foothill College in California, as well as dean of planning and research at Skyline College in California. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping things. We are recording this today for archives, and we do have a sign-in sheet in the back. If you haven't signed in at some point, if you wouldn't mind signing in, so we have a record of it. So thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dewey. Well, thank you guys for coming. I know how hard, especially it is on a Tuesday. What day is it? Tuesday? Where am I? Tuesday morning, and to come away. How many faculty in the room? So a good number of faculty for a morning. That's awesome. So yeah, we're going to chat the next 2 hours about some of the key frameworks and principles behind completion by design, and I'll get into that in a minute. And it is going to be more of a conversation. You're going to have a couple times where you're going to break out and talk to each other. This is not going to be a one-way sit and listen for 2 hours. Most guys in Hawaiian shirts don't do that. But I just want to give a little backdrop too. It was a great introduction by Dewey. I've spent a lot of time the last couple of years traveling around the country as a consultant, and as Dewey mentioned, I actually this year opened up this National Center for Inquiry and Improvement. I was a group in California called the Research and Planning Group, the RP Group, who kind of mainly focused in California, mainly focused on research and evaluation and data. And my background, I also came from industry about 10 years ago to community colleges where I did strategic consulting, where I started around data and then it evolved into marketing and then it eventually moved into strategic consulting. So I have this kind of dual perspective. And some of the stuff that we're going to talk about, I think, is actually really informed by what we learned in industry in the late 90s and early 2000s as well. There's that lag we have between industry and higher education, especially on the data side. And this is not going to be a deep conversation about data for a couple hours. But before I get going, I want to do a little, I think I like to start off with to set kind of the tone, is I've had an opportunity to do a lot of presentations in the last couple of years across the country. And so I've amassed kind of a list of what goes well and what doesn't go well in presentations and settings. So I'll share with you some of the challenging situations I've encountered in presentations. So first, I once presented on the fourth day of a 4-day conference in New Orleans at 8 a.m. And you know you're in trouble when you're still out on Bourbon Street at 2 a.m., seeing the people who are supposed to be in your 8 a.m. session, wondering how great that was going to go. So that was the challenge. There's like 8 of us sitting together, staring at each other. Coffee. I presented in Dallas. I presented in Dallas at Dallas County Community College District. I think it's maybe started last year. And it was their first, I guess Dallas has like 7 colleges in there. And this is the first time they'd gotten everyone together, all faculty, staff, and administrators from all 7 colleges, like 1,100 people. This huge gymnasium at one of the colleges. And so I'm walking up to the stage, and their chancellor, great guy, calls me over and says, "Yeah, Rob, so no pressure, but the last person to present on this stage was President Obama last week." Okay, so I got to follow that. And then that gets better. He goes, oh, and by the way, we're going to have our student choir is going to come up and do a couple musical numbers to kick off the day. So they come up and do like these rousing renditions, really good, but rousing renditions from like Rent and Wicked. And the chancellor gets up after that and says, all right, now here's Rob Johnstone to talk about data for a couple hours. Not great setup there for that. I also have, and this is a good setup for a room, I've fallen off a stage during a presentation. As you see, I wander around a lot. And I've also fallen through a door into another room. You know how the conference presentations, they have the breakout rooms, they have the divider. So I'm presenting with a colleague, and she's up here presenting. And I just kind of casually walk back, and I lean against the wall. Turns out it wasn't the wall, it was a door that was partially open. So I fall into the next room, and do I get lucky enough that the next room is empty? No, of course not. The next room's completely full. And this is absolutely true. I will give myself some small amount of credit, because I fell down on my back, popped up and said, how's everyone doing anything? Everything okay in here? I'm going to go back over there and finish up. You guys, I hope things are good. That was probably the most embarrassing. But the best presentation story I have I was actually not the presenter. And you can tell a lot about a presenter when they walk up to the stage. And so this was a presentation in California at a Southern California hotel. And the guy's walking up to the stage. It's during lunch, which is one of my pet peeves about when you have presentations during lunch, which is everyone's been in sessions all morning, most of them are boring, and you finally get a chance to talk to people you haven't seen in a while, and they bring someone like me up to interrupt your lunch while people are still eating and talking. So this is already a bad setup, although it's not as bad as I've actually been asked to present during happy hour, which if you know me is the last person who wants to be on this side during happy hour. So this guy's walking up to the stage and he's bringing his notes with him. He's walking like this, so you know he's going to read his notes for the next 30 minutes over lunch. And so he gets up to the podium. This is going to sound like I'm making this up, but I swear to God this is true. He gets up to the podium, and this is a Southern California hotel. Okay? So it's one of those hotel conference centers that one of the rooms out by the pool. Gets better. So there's a pool right behind this guy. All right? And so as he's walking up there, the door opens going out to the pool, and out walks the Miss Fitness California swimsuit pageant photo shoot. 30 bikini-clad women come out wearing the sashes and literally go right behind him. And they're doing the photo shoot right behind this guy's head for the next 45 minutes. So the good news, and I turned to a friend of mine after this has happened, I said, if this guy ever actually looked up from his notes, it would have been the most eye contact anyone has ever made with him in the history of his presentations, because everyone was pretty gripped. So this actually looks pretty good here. I think we got a decent room. I'm trying to set a tone here. We want to have a good, try to have a good time. This is serious. We do serious work here at community colleges. When I landed in the community colleges 10 years ago, it was kind of an amazing, mission. The mission of community colleges and what we all wrestle with on a day-to-day basis, trying to improve things for our students. It's hard. We have to remind ourselves sometimes that we're really doing amazing work here. And at the end of the day, much of what's happening in this country in higher education is going to be based on how well we do in community colleges at getting more students through with degrees of high quality and certificates of high quality and transfer to be ready to transfer. And so we're going to talk about that today. So some acknowledgements first. Much of the content in this presentation, we've got a host of partners on Completion by Design. I've spent about half my time the last 3 years as one of the national assistance team for Completion by Design. And I'll talk about that and what that actually is in a second. You guys are getting involved in kind of CBD 2.0 here in North Carolina. The Gates Foundation has funded Completion by Design, worked very closely with CCRC, the Community College Research Center, and Davis Jenkins and the great team of folks from up there in New York. Folks like Public Agenda is another great organization also out of New York that focuses on actual faculty engagement and practitioner engagement, the idea that if you actually want to have social change happen on the ground, it has to involve the practitioners and not just be something that comes from up on top and people are told what to do. You got to understand, in most community colleges, the leverage of change, you need leaders who are great catalysts for change, but at the end of the day, whether change works and happens is going to be decided by how it plays out on the ground. And there are some folks in foundations and others who forget that very important point. That at the end of the day, no matter how good an idea or a principle is, it's how it gets played out by the people on the ground. This is, by the way, a problem we had in industry too. People forgot this as well. We tried earlier. There's only dark and light. Yeah. I know. Yeah. It's okay. It's good. It's all good. And then other folks like RP Group and West Ed. So the agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about the context of completion. We'll talk a little bit about CBD. We're going to have some fun and visualize the student experience. And then we're going to spend most of our time in these last two, exploring the loss momentum framework and engaging with the principles for redesign. One of the things I like about CBD is, unlike a lot of grants and initiatives where they tell you exactly what you're going to do, and you as the other side either pretend that what you're doing matches what they told you what to do, or try to do what they're going to do even though it doesn't fit your culture. One of the nice things about CBD, and you'll see this when we get through it later today, is the idea behind this is about some principles of redesign. It's not saying do these 4 things exactly this way. It says knowing what you know about, and no one knows Gaston College better than you. And you know the unique evolutionary history of your change efforts to here, your unique student population, your data. And the idea behind CBD is to marry what you already know with some principles to potentially drive this forward and improve student success. So, the completion agenda and the CBD initiative. So, just real quickly on completion. This has been 3 years ago, there was no completion agenda in community colleges. We talked about student success for a while. First, we had a big student success agenda, and that a little what we worry about is the kind of phrase of the month type thing that comes along. First we had data-driven decision-making, cultures of evidence, and I do a whole other set of presentations on why the concept of data-driven decision-making and a culture of evidence is incredibly limiting and probably wrong, because never once has data made a decision in the history of time. People make decisions using data, and that sounds like a trivial point. The problem is we had this assumption. Industry did the same thing. We had this assumption that as long as we had data and we had evidence, everything would magically get better. Right? So we focused a lot on getting data. And we don't have any problem with having data now or having evidence. What we have problems doing is trying to find the time and space to actually make meaning out of it, derive insight out of it, and actually translate that into action. So I do a whole other set of presentations and workshops on that idea of how do we drive innovation, actually extracting what we know from data. If we have some time, maybe I'll show you some of that a little bit later. But this idea of the completion agenda, this is a national movement. The White House has been behind this probably more than almost anyone in D.C. And this has been a huge change from 5 years ago. When Martha Cantor went to be Undersecretary of Education in the first Obama administration, that was the first time a community college, someone from the community college system had been that high up in the Department of Education. As Undersecretary of Education, obviously she helped elevate, and Arne Duncan also helped elevate the sector of community colleges. Now, not all of that elevation, by the way, comes with positive kind of a halo, because one of the things that also came with that is a much greater call for accountability in community colleges. And accountability can be a double-edged sword, right? It's probably a good idea that we're more focused on our outcomes, but it's also not a great idea if people who don't really understand community colleges are setting accountability metrics. That's one of the things that you heard from my background from Dewey. I've spent 10 years on the ground, 11 years on the ground with community colleges, and so I kind of live in this world of foundations and initiatives and policy, but I also, at the heart of I'm one of you. I'm a practitioner. I've been a dean at a college. I've been a vice president of instruction. I've taught part-time, not full-time. I understand what community colleges are like because I've lived on them. And I can tell you, from having worked with some of these people in D.C. and from some of these, and they're very well-intentioned people, they don't understand community colleges very well. And so when they talk about completion, they're thinking about what? When folks in D.C. and your accountability folks talk about completion, what are they measuring usually? Degrees and transfer, and if you're lucky, certificates. And there's a whole debate about certificates, right? About how long a certificate needs to be counted in accountability. And, I'll talk in a second about some data from California that suggests that short-term certificates, by the way, may be one of the biggest functions that we have in community colleges in terms of immediate wage gains for students. And that's something that's very rarely measured in the completion agenda. But the rest of us who've been on community colleges know that there's a lot of other missions of community colleges that tend to get left out of completion conversations. What would some of those be? What's some of the other, what else do we do in community colleges besides degrees, certificates, and transfer? Workforce training. This is a big one right here. Hold on to that one for a second because I'm going to talk about this in a second. But workforce training is a huge one, like short-term, 1-class, 2-class workforce training for people who already have jobs. So in California, we ran a study a couple of years ago with a researcher from the University of Michigan, Peter Barr, took all of the entering 275,000 students in, I think it was fall 2005, to the California Community College system across the system, and he ran them through a segmentation, like a black box cluster analysis, statistical segmentation, and he extracted 6 very interesting groups. And so we had the classic groups. We had the kind of degree and transfer focused ones who were successful. We had the degree and transfer who were unsuccessful. You had cohort-based career tech, things like nursing and allied health. Thanks, Dewey. Things like nursing and allied health and auto tech. Then you had kind of the lifelong learning courses. You had folks who were only in dev ed. But he had this other really interesting segment of students. And so this segment came in. They took 1 or 2 courses. They had a 95% success rate in those courses. Not everyone who took 1 or 2 courses had a 95% success rate. This group did. 1 or 2 courses, 95% success rate, and we never saw them again. So they came in, popped in, took a course or 2, 95% success rate, never saw them again. So what do you think they're taking, that group? If you look at the top 3 departments, what are the 3 departments they're taking? Let me ask you another question first. What does the public think those students are taking? And sometimes policy people. They think that the public, at least in many states, and you guys probably are better in this than most states, the public thinks they're taking like ceramics and PE and art to travel to Italy. And by the way, not to demean any of those as functions of community colleges, because if you're a true community colleges, that's part of what you do. That's what the public and accountability people think they're taking. You know what they're actually taking? Computer science, number 1. Number 2, it's actually not math. The reason it's not math is accounting's number 2. Math's not up there because very few students come in to just take math and then leave. The only students who, by the way, tend to do that are university students trying to get that one class. So that does happen, but it's relatively smaller than this other group, at least in California. And the third one would be business, actually. So computer science, accounting, business. So here are students who come in, they take 1 or 2 courses, and they have 95% success rates, we never see them again. Guess how big that group was as a percentage of the overall population? It was 1/3. 1/3 of the entering students fit that. Now, I think it's probably a little lower in North Carolina and probably a little lower now in California 6 years later, because we've made it harder for those students to find classes through policy changes. When California had a huge, we won't get off for 5 hours on the California budget and the insanity that is the California system, but there was a 20% basic drop in the courses you could offer in California because we have enrollment caps, which is an insane system, meaning that if you, theoretically, if you're a college and you had 10,000 FTES last year and you have 12,000 this year, you only get paid for 10,000. So you're actually incented to not grow unless you grow at this very measured pace. And recently in California, they took the 10,000 and lopped off 10% and said you were only going to fund you for 9,000. And California, like you, doesn't keep local tuition either. So the source of funding, so it's a crazy model. So I think that what you probably find fewer of those students now. You think after 20 years of presentations I'd get less and fewer, right? Still don't. You'd get fewer of those students, but 33%, like 32% of those students fit that group. 1 or 2 courses, 95% success rate, never saw them again. None of those students, by the way, exactly 0 of those students will ever be measured by any accountability completion metric, right? Now, partially this is because we don't really know who they are either, because they come in, they take a course, they leave, and it's hard for us until they've done that, and we run a segmentation to even know who they were. So part of this is a little bit on us to try to figure out how to actually measure who these students are so we know that they met their goals, right? But part of it's just the challenge is that the public doesn't really understand that that's a big function of community colleges. So having said all that, and that's an important group, we need to do a better job of understanding that group of students. And by the way, when we looked at some wage gains, we ran some wage data. That group of students who came in, took 1 or 2 courses, and got this 95% success rate had pretty amazing early wage gain bumps of between $5,000 and $10,000, depending on the time, in California wages, so a little higher. But pretty amazing that this group, we have this effect with only 1 or 2 courses. We actually don't have, they're not in programs, but they're bouncing in and they're leaving and they're getting what they need. So having said all that, one thing we do want to do, by the way, and I don't bring this up to say we shouldn't pay attention to completion as we typically measure it, but we also do need to understand we have different groups of students here. Like this group of students is not a trivial one for a number of reasons. It's not trivial to them, first of all, and they're not trivial to us because it does serve to kind of broaden the understanding most of the public has of community colleges. So now that I talked about that group, we're going to ignore them for the next hour and 40 minutes. So we identified them, called them out, now we're going to ignore them. And we're going to talk about the group that's focused on degrees, transfers, and certificates. And so when I talk about a nuanced view, I'm talking about this issue. And there's, by the way, the last group we tend to forget about is the lifelong learning group. The group of, basically, this is the one that's very political, right? Because it's the community members in your area, the ones who tend to have money, who want courses at the community college to meet their needs, right? Because historically, community colleges have been all things to all people, right? And so this is one of the challenges as you run into budget cycles, is how to serve these various groups of students, the recent high school students, the returning adults going kind of full-time on a cohort basis. Got a lot going on here. But this group of lifelong learning, this is particularly political in California and Texas, where they're really trying to get rid of being able to serve that group at all, which of course are the ones who vote on bond measures. So it doesn't really, kind of a tough situation to be in. All right, what's the challenge of completion? So for colleges, there's a financial challenge. There's not a lot of states in the country where community college budgets have gone up for FTES in the last 10 or 15 years. Most of them have been static or gone down, even as inflation has risen. And so it's not as if colleges have a lot of extra money sitting around to fund completion efforts. It's a little easier if you're at a large private university with a big endowment to have a bunch of more scaled type initiatives to help students complete. We don't have that luxury for the most part. The other issue, and I'm not going to pop my head into the performance funding debate, the whack-a-mole performance funding debate about whether that's a good or a bad idea, but I will say this. One thing, I was talking a second ago how policymakers and accountabilities don't really understand much about what's going on the ground. We also need to understand from the ground how policymakers and accountability folks see us. And when they look at us, most of them being businessmen, people from industry, they look at us and they say, so you guys have all of your incentives based on exactly one thing, which is getting a butt into this seat on the third Monday of each semester. That's basically, in most states still, how we're funded. And so in their minds, they don't see how we can actually focus ourselves on completion if our whole funding structure is based on this. Now, those of us within the system say, while our funding system is based on this, we're here for a social mission or we wouldn't be in community colleges. And so this debate is working on two different levels, right? So whether or not performance funding comes in, and I, by the way, have yet to see a performance funding system that's actually made completion better. Doesn't make it worse, but it's a lot of effort. What tends to happen in states is they put a lot of effort into designing a system, and small amounts of money get moved around, and it doesn't change very much. But having said that, there are a lot of states right now, I think it's something like 17 states, who are in some form of performance funding for community colleges. This isn't going away. Ohio is going to 100% performance funding in a couple of years. And we as practitioners all have that worry in our heads about this is going to lead to degree factories, it's going to lead to lessening the quality of education, which, by the way, are really important things to manage and take care of. But I think we do need at some point to realize we got to find a middle ground here that makes sense. And there are some states who are trying middle ground things, so hopefully we will have some models in the near future on this. But the bottom line here is we do have to acknowledge we are not incented to have students complete. We're incented from a moral and ethical standpoint, but there's no financial incentive for students to complete right now. Here's another big one. I think this was one. We have a great history of innovation. Every college in this country has innovation going on its campus. Innovation's been going on for the last 30 years. We haven't really moved the completion rate up much in the last 30 years either. I have a slide in my other presentation that shows the completion rate in the California Community College system in the last 20 years. The line goes like this. Hasn't moved an inch. And we've done a lot. Now that may be, by the way, it may be because we were more under-resourced than they were 20 years ago, or the colleges are bigger, that we would have gotten worse had we not done this. But we haven't really moved the needle in any significant way on student completion in the last 20 years. And one of the questions of that is why, right? And I think one of the big answers to that is that innovations really tend to be isolated. How many interventions do we have on all of our campuses that serve 30 or 50 people? That's where most of our innovation is serving a small number of students. And the other reason I'd say that happens is partially because we don't change the core model very much. Like the structure basically stays the same, and we kind of nudge at it on the margins. We add a little tutoring here, we do a little supplemental instruction there, but the core basically stays the same. And we know what we're going to get from that core. We're going to get the same completion rates we have now. So we'll talk about some of the things that might nudge it a little more in a second. And org change is hard. The story of, I've worked on the Aspen Prize the last couple of years, and the Aspen Prize, which largely gets good press, the one bit of bad press, of course, in the Aspen Prize is that the algorithm they use to pick the first 120 colleges out of 1,200 challenges some states because of the way they They use a metric called degrees per 100 FTES. And there are some states who do a lot of things for credit that go into the denominator of the FTES, like North Carolina and like California, that make it more challenging for colleges to get into that top 10%. I will say that once the top 10 are picked, and I'm part of that kind of process of providing data for that, you got some pretty amazing colleges in there. Not to say there aren't other ones out there, but these are colleges who have moved the needle on student success. And one of them, the first winner of the Aspen Prize was Valencia College, which tends to be the one college nationally that people know for innovation. They've been doing things for maybe the better part of a decade, things like LifeMap, things like really changing their student services. They've changed some of their structures. And if you talk to Sandy Shugart, their president, he says that culture change takes between 5 and 10 years. You don't change culture overnight. And at the end of the day, it's the culture that needs to change to have these things happen. The things they've done to improve student success. It's not any specific strategy they've used, it's a culture around it. And when you go to Valencia, you feel it when you're there. There's a palpable sense of every person on that campus knows what their role is in improving completion, and they're constantly thinking of ways to try to improve it. One of the things I love about them, they've built into their tenure process and their hiring process, so that every new full-time faculty member who gets hired is required to, as part of their tenure process, not just teach, but do a research project on something related to student success and student completion in their classroom. So they're doing classroom-based research to try to, and they know this before they are hired. They actually are told, they're asked during their final interview, what are you going to study in your classroom going forward? And so they have every new faculty member doing that every year. And so there's just the knowledge you generate from that, improving student success, but the other thing is they get them together to talk about it every year. And they get the campus together to talk about what they're learning from each of these 10 to 12 research projects every year. So there's this collective knowledge base that then acts to move forward. And again, that's a model that's pretty far down a path than where most of us are. But it goes to the idea of if you really are going to improve something like completion, it's going to take a number of different things at a number of different levels to get there. For students, it's easy to enroll, easy to drop out. We actually sometimes don't even know when students enter or leave a program or drop out. Many enter without a clear plan and are placed into DevEd. We're going to talk about, and obviously I'm in North Carolina, so you guys have a little bit going on the DevEd side, a small amount. Doing some modularization, the whole placement thing, which you guys started this fall. I want to talk about that in a second too. And then students have a lot of non-cognitive issues. There's a lack of resources, lack of confidence, financial resources, social capital, things like hope, motivation, kind of cultural capital that we may or may not do a great job of developing here at community colleges. And so here's CBD. It's Gates' biggest investment in community college. It's about a $50 million grant. I'm here today as part of a tendril of that grant, which is to help scale and adopt CBD in the states that were in it. But there are 3 states that Completion by Design operates in, Florida, North Carolina, and Ohio. 5 of the 9 colleges that are still in CBD are in North Carolina. It's your colleagues at Central Piedmont, Davidson, Guilford Tech, Martin, and Wake Tech. Got that right. I've been spending much of the last 2 years driving between those 5 colleges. It's been a lot of fun. I love North Carolina. It sounds like it's something I'd say everywhere, but I really do love North Carolina. You guys have a great state here. Really good weather, nice campuses. 3 phases for CBD: planning, implementation, scaling, and adoption. We're kind of in the middle of the latter part of implementation right now and moving towards this idea of scaling and adoption. I'm partially here because I think North Carolina's done possibly the best job in CBD at this. Ed Bowling, who runs the project up from Guilford Tech, and the folks you guys have in Raleigh on the system side, have been really helping create resources to make this project a little bigger than just these 5 colleges. And Thursday and Friday, some of your folks are going to be going up to Greensboro for this CBD Learning Institute, where you get to hear me again. Get bored of the guy in the Hawaiian shirt. I'll have a different Hawaiian shirt on, I promise, for you guys are there. And we'll be working more on this, and I know you're going to be, this is a kind of a test of like CBD light, right? You guys aren't getting the $50 million, but we're going to hope we can get you some of the ideas under there. And by the way, these colleges don't see that much of that money when you start dividing it out over a long period of time. None of the money from CBD helps colleges in an ongoing way do anything differently. It's all catalytic kind of thought leadership that helps move the needle on this stuff. So, what's the idea of CBD? The idea is that we can redesign systems and practices to improve student success. By the way, there's a fundamental core belief you have to kind of sign on to do this work, and that is that much of the reason that student success is as relatively low as it is our issue, not the student's issue. We've got a 30-year history of finding unique ways to blame the student or their families or K-12 or anyone else we can think of about the problems in student success, and not much of a history of asking, what is it about us? Not to say that those things all don't exist, but we don't control any of those things. We don't have any control in the community college. We have some control over the K-12 thing if we can work with them to make it better. We don't have control over the product that comes out of K-12. We don't have control over the unique set of issues that a student brings to us. We don't have control over the parenting issues and the family structures and all the other things that we tend to blame this on. And while those are all important, we do have control over the systems and structures that we put into place that try to help students get through. And I will ask you this, the model we have for higher education in America, and we'll just talk community colleges for a second, when was that model developed? The general model we use for higher education. 1650-ish in Oxford, right, in England. This is in the 12th century. You can go back even farther and claim that it goes there. The model we're using is centuries old, literally centuries old. If you stepped into a classroom in most colleges, not community colleges, this isn't a Gastonia issue. You stepped into a classroom in most colleges in this country right now, it's 10:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, and you look at what the classroom looks like, it's not much different than what it looks like in Oxford in 1650. There's someone standing in front of the room, there's a bunch of people behind tables, and there's a relatively one-way interaction, and that's the model we're using. And it's a series of those classes that we think is going to create somehow this educational experience that's in sync. Now, there are exceptions to this, and we're going to talk about some of them, because where you see those exceptions, you also see higher completion rates. Okay? So the idea here is to look at what are some of the barriers and momentum points that students experience. Then look at promising practices, create the conditions for change, and at the bottom here, build infrastructure for continuous improvement. This is all great, but let's get into some of the actual stuff here. So let's talk about the student experience for a second. So, let's take a student. Let's take a successful student. Here's a successful student's path to completion at most of our community colleges. So this is, by the way, again, I'll remind you, someone who got through. So they start, we'll even take a first-time student. So we'll take the prototypical recent high school graduate, and they're going to find their way to completion. So maybe they have some positive things that happen along the way. Maybe they join a learning community. Learning communities have come to mean about 6 million different things now in the last 10 years. But largely, learning communities are seen as a kind of a momentum point or a catalytic motion towards success. You know, they might have some other things going on. Maybe getting to a financial aid workshop, joining a club. These are all potentially things that could help them. Enrolling in summer session, there's research on this that actually suggests that it helps students. Becoming a mentor, these are the type of things that happen on the path to completion. But what the path really looks like for most students, it's more like this. And remember, this is a successful student. This is someone who jumps through all of those hoops and figures out a way to get through. This is what the world looks like to our students. One of my friends from California, who's a math instructor, used to be our state academic senate president, said, "Rob, I love this slide for showing the chaos of student completion, but it's still linear." And if you think about it, our students' paths are in no way linear. They're circling back on themselves a lot. But look, think about what's happening to students. They have things that are helping them, meeting with outreach if they're lucky, applying to the institution, they maybe get financial aid. Here's an interesting one, taking the assessment test without adequate preparation. So we did focus groups, by the way, with students who just took the placement test. No, this is a little preaching to the choir because you guys have already made a change on this. But I just want to share with you how this went 5 years ago. If you did focus groups of students who just took the placement test, they tended to go something like this. So you'd ask the student, all right, so you just finished taking the placement test. Talk a little bit, how did you get here? What brought you to take the placement? How did you get to this point? And the student quite often would say something like, well, I came to campus this morning to register, or I tried to register online. I came to campus this morning to register. They told me I couldn't register unless I took the placement test. So I walked over to the placement office, I waited in line for 2 hours, and then I took 2 placement tests, and now I'm sitting here with you. You ask them the next question. So did they tell you what this placement test was? What was the story with this placement test? No, they just said, go take it. I got to do this before I register. By the way, until recently with changes you're making in North Carolina, this was the single most important and most predictive event in their entire higher education career in terms of whether they would complete, how long it would take, and how much of a pain in the A it would be, right? And first of all, we didn't tell them any of that. We also might ask the question why we've made this the single most important event in their entire career. You know, we know, by the way, if they test 3 levels below in math, what percentage of them ever get to transfer level? It's like 7%. Between 6 and 10% at every college in this country. One of college maybe above 10%. Many of those students are there because they have the skills to be there. Some of them are there because we put them there, right? Now, again, there's a little bit of a choir thing going on here because whether you like it or not, in North Carolina, you guys have taken this huge step. And I want to tell you, as someone who works on a national stage, I am so happy you guys are doing this. I really think you are going to pave the way for the rest of the country to understand that we have been severely underplacing students. Not all students, but severely underplacing students, and increasingly doing so in the last 30 years, right? We have created a model in community colleges where over the last 30 years, we have made it harder for students to get into transfer level work and not easier. We have not tried to say, what can we do to make students get into transfer level work and support them? We've continued. When was the last time you heard of a college lowering their cut score? Like, I've heard colleges raise their cut score 7 times in 10 years. And in fact, I'll tell you that story. And this is a little bit of every time I present in North Carolina, and I have for the last 2 years since this idea came out, I have guaranteed to people, and if this doesn't work, I am going to owe a lot of people a lot of drinks. Because I've told them, I will buy you a drink if this doesn't work at your college, because I guarantee you will get more students through transfer level. It is almost a mathematical certainty. California story, Long Beach City College, which is like, I think, the one college who was doing something similar to what you're doing in North Carolina. They were doing it in parallel. About 2 years ago, their English department was trying to raise their cut score again for the 7th time in 10 years. So that to get into transfer level math, the cut score would have gone up so that only 10 or 11% of the entering freshman class, transfer level English, would test into transfer level English. And so their researcher ran some numbers and happened to be able to tie in transcript data from the high school, because we have a data sharing agreement in California that's localized for the high school. They had good data. So he actually ran a bunch of statistical analyses to see if there was a better way to predict success in the transfer level course. Not surprisingly, there is, right? The placement test is a 90-minute test, if you're lucky. Sometimes it's 45 minutes per subject. And we're using it to place students based on 13 years of education, hopefully into the right place. By the way, the placement tests were never designed for this purpose anyway, just as an aside. So he put an algorithm together. It's a little different than the way you guys are doing it, because it takes like 6 variables, throws them into a statistical hopper, and predicts success in transfer level courses. Of course, it works better than the placement test, and here's the kicker. So he, using this algorithm, predicted a group of students coming in that same time period that would go into transfer level English and have the same predicted level of success. The kicker is it was 6 times as large. Nearly 60% of the students at this college from this high school district could be placed into transfer level English with the same predicted level of success. So the obvious response to this is, well, no way, is one of the obvious responses. 2 is, show me. Show me the data, show me what happened. The amazing part about this story, especially because it comes from California community colleges, is they actually did this. The English department said, okay, let's do it. Let's put 60% of the students in transfer level English next fall using this algorithm. So they did this last fall 2012. The success rate in English 1A, which is the transfer level course, the year before, when they only had the 10 or 12% in, was 57%. You can argue whether that's high or low, or it's probably pretty much standard for that type of course. What do you think the success rate was the next year with 6 times as many students in there? 56.2. It went down 0.8%. Think about that for a second. They got 6 times the number of students in there. Now, again, they did some other things around this. They did a lot of counseling to make sure this worked. By the way, some of the very things that you're going to be doing around your now placement of students in North Carolina. But they had 6 times as many students in there, pretty good set of structured support, same level of success as the ones who tested in. So it calls into question this process we've been using to keep more and more students out of these courses. Did their courses change? Any English 1A instructors in here or math intermediate algebra instructors in here? You're probably worried about or concerned or thinking, depending on where you are on the worry scale, about what's going to happen to your classroom when you make this change. Any of you teaching those courses right now? You guys made the change this fall, right? Honestly, and I know you're in a room full of people who are your colleagues, so you're not completely anonymous, but how has the classroom changed that much this fall?
Not at all.
Not at all?
I was still worried about it.
Hasn't changed very much, and yours changed a little, so what do you notice?
2 sections, and one of them has changed. I have students that are ADA.
Right.
Seriously.
Yeah,
But
so
they try hard, and that changes the momentum of some of the other students who are below it.
So there are a couple interesting points, and this is why I think this is such an important, but you guys are the Petri dish right now, and I know that sometimes sucks to be the Petri dish, but not you, Gaston, but the state of North Carolina. So I think it's really interesting that what you start to see is they're either similar in how they get there, or you can see some things that maybe you can use to move that group. But absolutely, we had a problem with yeah.
I've been hearing that we're having more problem in math.
More problem in math than English.
And there's not any math instructors in here. The time he teaches online, he says they suck online all the time.
Well, yeah, that's a different issue, right? Yeah, it's an important issue, but a different one. What do you think, Fabian? Is it, and be honest, if it's really significantly different, let us know. What do you think?
Different.
Yeah.
It is tough.
How is it? Talk about it a little, because by the way, I think no one should have been surprised that it is both going to be different and a little tougher for those of you on the front lines in these classes, because we completely changed the model from this very exclusionary, you have to be sure you can get in, sorry for the visual, model of that. Sometimes these things happen. Can you take that off the, we're going to film that part again, YouTube, to a model where we know some people will now be overplaced. Right? So absolutely it's going to change. If you change the makeup of a class by basically 30 or 40%. So what have you been trying to do with that? Because the challenge for you, of course, is to not make sure that you slow things down for everyone else. That's a huge challenge. What have you guys been doing in there?
More group work.
Yeah.
Definitely try to get them to try to work harder outside of class.
Yeah.
Just
Emphasize that more.
a lot of communication. I work harder.
Right. And there's an interesting question whether you'll work harder 2 years from now once you've figured out the way to do this. And the answer may still be yes, right? I don't know the answer to it. But it's interesting, like some of the stuff that you discussed there. So one of the things I think we've had an issue with, and this, by the way, gets to the somewhat controversial, and I'm speaking for myself now for any agency, we haven't spent a lot of time thinking about what happens in the four walls of the classroom, right? We spend a lot trying to fix the stuff around the classroom, and this is forcing you guys, whether you like it or not, to have to really work on that stuff that goes on in here. And I'm not saying it was wrong before or is going to be right now. It just changes it, right? And that change is both scary and a challenge. And I fully expect that you guys are going to have some things going on that'll be a little more challenging. And I would guess it will be slightly harder in math than it would be in English. So, yeah, no. She says no. All right, well, maybe it's equally hard in both. Yeah.
I suspect that part of the problem might be multiple measures kind of coming in. I mean, not only do we have the huge change in developmental, but we have multiple measures coming in at the same time, so you really don't know what's the causating factor to having greater difficulty.
Because it could be, it's probably a combination of both, right? Especially because, and having taught math and statistics, we have taught historically, not all of us, math and statistics in a fairly similar pedagogical way, right? And this is very different. So you have a huge pedagogy change. You have a huge change in the student mix. There's a lot of change going on. The good news is, I think, from the Long Beach study and from others, when you look at this group of students who entered this fall and how many of them made it through transfer level math, I bet you're going to see at least 20% more, and maybe 30. Statway and Quantway, and I saw some nods when you talked about Statway and Quantway. I work with them a little bit. One of the things I'm trying to work with them on is getting their data out to the public more, because they've got some great success data that no one knows about. The first cohort of Statway Quantway colleges, the rate of success of getting through transfer level math in 3 years from the base control group in Statway Quantway was about 20%. So the old model, in about 3 years, you'd get 20% through from the level that people started Statway and Quantway. Statway and Quantway in 1 year got 52% of their students through. 2.5 times as many students through Statway Quantway in 1 year versus the old model in 3 years. That's the type of, the combination of things you're doing, I expect to have roughly that level of influence. Maybe it's not 2.5 times. And again, Statway Quantway, I know there's some controversy about what happens when you take out certain pieces of intermediate algebra and you lead to statistics. There's a whole debate about that. I refuse to get involved in Math Wars 3, as I've been told this is called. Although I will point out that 80% of students probably don't need this calculus pathway. And there is a question about whether these students coming out of Statway and Quantway will do equally well in Gen Ed, will do equally well when they transfer, and whether they have the mathematical skills they need to reason in the real world. Those are very fair questions. We'll have data on that soon. I can answer the first two questions pretty confidently, that those students are going to do just as fine as the students who made it through the regular math sequence and the GE and in graduation type courses. The question of whether they have the skills to operate in the real world is a debate I am on one side of, but it's a very reasonable debate. So the bottom line in all of this, I think, is that there are these points on a pathway that students are on that we have let become these amazing bottlenecks or these amazing loss points. We spent a lot of time in the last 10 years focusing all of it on Dev Ed. What I'm going to talk about in a minute is actually broadening this to a discussion that's more than just DevEd. But the point of this slide, by the way, is that we've let it become this chaotic. It does look like this to our students. And so one of the questions we can ask is, how do we provide some order to this chaos? We're going to talk about some other things that are on here in a second too. So let's talk about the lost momentum framework. This is a concept. This is Mark Milliron and Debbie Greif, who both used to be at Gates, based on a lot of the research from Davis Jenkins and CCRC. Put together this simple framework, and it is simple. This isn't rocket science, guys. This is, what does it look like for students as they move through our institutions? And it basically just kind of breaks it into 4 stages. There's connection, which is kind of the upfront piece. What happens when they're getting to us to actually apply? There are some things that go on there that we can consider as things that help students increase their momentum. There's also some lost points there. Entry is kind of that classic when they enroll to getting through their gatekeeper courses, that kind of first semester idea, maybe first 2 semesters. Progress is when you get into a program of study. I'm going to talk a lot about this idea of program of study or course of study in a second, to making it almost 75% of the way through. And this last stage of completion is getting through the course of study with a credential, which is either degree or certificate, or transferring. And this says labor market value, but it also, the idea is that you transfer with a junior standing would be another one of these metrics. And that the idea is that there are policies, practices, programs, and processes that undergird the framework. So let's just come back to this for a second and ask this question. When you think about this framework at these 4 stages, what are some lost points that you see for students? What are some things that you see students running into as you think about these 4 stages? Why don't we have 80% graduation rates? So a lot of people kind of in this stage here, that kind of first semester. So why do we lose them in the first semester, you think? It's good, by the way, that you've looked at that, because you're right. You do lose, this is the classic attrition model where you lose 30% in the first semester and it starts sliding down. What do you think? Why do we think we lose so many students in the first semester? Unclear goals. Good one. We'll come back to that. I totally agree with you. It's like it's on the next slide, so I have to agree with you. What's in the back there? I planted that, by the way. What is it, though? So, yeah, there's a lot in there, right? Because I think there's a lot of hype. By the way, there's no answer here. There's no silver bullet answer. There's probably a lot of these things. But, connection to the college, connection to their peers. Then there's a whole other side. Kind of the college skills, study skills side. Another way you could even go with that is connection to something that matters to them as to where they're going. I think we really CBD thinks, and I think, we really underestimate this one. We like to say students don't connect, right? Because it's true. They're obviously not connecting. Many of them are leaving when they succeed, much less when they don't succeed. And so one of the questions there is, why don't they connect to something? What have we done to help them connect to something? We'll come back to this point. What else do you think is going on? Other lost points you see for students? So there's a non-cognitive kind of confidence issue, like either they come in with no confidence, or they come in the first semester and have a set of experiences that is very negative, either academically or kind of from a support standpoint, right? So that kind of challenge around that, I think that's a good one too. What else? Feel free, I love data.
We're doing a grant up against the National Science Foundation, so we were looking at our success rates in individual science courses, and they're all above 80%.
Yep.
But our graduation rate for associate science is 24%.
So why is that?
Exactly. That was
Exactly. He's like, why do you think it is? I mean, yeah.
It goes back to engagement, which is why we're writing a grant to incorporate undergraduate research experiences into problem-based learning.
Yeah.
Some things like that, more active learning strategies to try to get them engaged, because we felt like it was probably an engagement issue. Some of them we know leave, probably because they want to get the nursing program and they may go.
Yeah.
And then somewhere else, we get that there's going to be some of that factored into there, but even in the general biology courses that they wouldn't be taking for allied health, really great success rates, but still really low in terms of science.
Yeah, so I'll throw out a couple of hypotheses. I don't have any answers on that, but I'll throw out a couple of hypotheses. I think it goes back to the same issue she was discussing in the back, which is connection to something. So if you have 80% success rates in some pretty hard courses, like you talk about, a lot of courses are hard, but there's not a lot of people who drop into organic chemistry and say, I think I'm going to take organic chemistry. Like, you get people in there, they're pretty focused. But the question is, what pathway are they on? Right, one of the problems we have is we can look at success rates in a general bio course, and we think, 80% of these students are successful. But what are they making progress toward? Do they even know what pathway they're on? We don't know what pathway they're on. They don't know what pathway they're on. Even that group of pre-allied health folks, I'll share some stuff with you in a minute. There's a whole question about, I actually think there's this kind of hidden issue we have of doing a disservice to students by letting them just enroll for courses that are pre-allied health without telling them, hey, by the way, there's 20 times as many of you as there are spots in nursing, right? And I'll tell you a story. I'll just tell it now. I was going to tell it later. I'll tell it now. Stark State, one of the CBD colleges in Ohio, hit this issue head on. One of their CBD initiatives is they actually looked at, they have a nursing program and they have hundreds, if not over 1,000, pre-nursing students, okay? Which, by the way, is a sweet designation, which basically means come take whatever you want. It's sort of pre-nursing. So we all have this. So what they did was they went and looked at the number of students who, by the way, had a 3.0 GPA requirement to get in the nursing program. You guys have that too? Or is it soft? Because it was a hard requirement there. Some sort of, okay, so point systems, right. So that it can be a little different. So, but it's versions of the same thing here. Probably even more important to do what they did if you have a point system, because people really don't understand point systems. 3.0 GPA is pretty clear. So their IR guy ran a list of current students who had between a 2.0 and 2.9 GPA, who were taking clearly some combination of pre-nursing courses. And they put them on a continuum from, 2.0 to 2.6 to 2.9, 2.3 to 2.6, 2.0 to 2.3, and they crossed it by the number of units they'd taken. So if you've taken a lot of units, and you've got a 2.0 GPA, you've got almost no chance of getting into the nursing program ever. Literally no chance. So what they did was they created this matrix. They colored the boxes green, yellow, and red. For the green ones, they were either 2.7 to 2.9 with a lot of units, or kind of in the middle with some units. They said to those students, you guys can make it. Here's the path to making it. And by the way, here's a GPA calculator. So you can figure out how many courses you need to take and get what grade to make that 3.0. Because I guarantee you, these are even pretty good students. If you asked any of them how many courses it would take to raise their 2.72 GPA with 42 units to a 3.0, many of them could calculate it, but they haven't. Right? And we haven't asked them to. Right? So they did that for those students. For the yellow students, kind of the middle bar, who were farther away with more units, they said, look, you can get there. Here's the calculator to figure out what it would look like. And for many of them, it looked like you're going to need 8 classes and you need to get a 4.0 in those classes. So they started saying to those students, maybe you could think about some of our other allied health programs. The last group, the red group, who were 2.0 to 2.3 students with like 40 units, who essentially have no chance of getting there. They'd need like 80 courses at an A. They called them in. They called them into the office. They had advisors who literally called every one of them and said, we'd like you to come in and talk to us. And they told them, look, I know this has been your goal, and I know this is what you wanted to do here, but here's the reality. Hard to get people crying in their offices, right? Hard conversations. But they did it, and you're thinking about, I don't want students crying in my office if you're a counselor, but here's the deal. If they don't do that, those students are crying 3 years later, and they've lost everything. And the thing is, nursing's great. Nursing's great. There are lots of other programs that have the same sometimes more employability for the same salary. And we don't do anything to counsel these students down this path. So, by the way, that group of students in the red was like 500 students. And they're probably on your campus too, right? And so one question is, so this comes back to the idea of not knowing where our students are on pathways, and this is an unintentional disservice we're doing by just offering courses. Right? So this is part of, I've previewed somewhere where we're going to get with CBD, but part of the thinking of CBD is thinking about where students are trying to get to and helping them make choices, or at the very least structuring those choices. So those are all clearly lost points. I'll share with you some of the lost points that we've identified, kind of from the research and from the folks in the project. So at Connection, this is kind of up front. Students never applying to college, students delaying entry into college, and this sounds like we're kind of hating on the counselors here, which we're not doing. The point about this, any counselors in the room? One, we won't hate on you, don't worry about it, it's all good. But the idea is that, how often do you get to, first of all, it's not mandatory for entering students to see you, right? A counselor? Not exactly, right? And how long do you get with them? 25 minutes? 30 to 40 minutes. During which, by the way, you're supposed to figure out everything that they want, have led up to here. And by the way, a lot of it tends to be about the placement process historically, because you're stuck trying to explain it to them, get them to and literally help them navigate what it's like to come into the school. And by the way, in all that, you're also supposed to help them figure out what program they want in 33 minutes. Like, this is a pretty big challenge we've got here, and it's not the counselor's fault. You only have a certain amount of counselors and a certain amount of students. That's if a student gets to this point, and not all of them raise their hands, right? We did this interesting study about 8 years ago. We had this swipe system in this college, Foothill, I was in California when I was provost. And students swiped whenever they went through any student service, right? Which is funny, because the technology came available, we started using it, and then no one does it anymore, but maybe it's just too expensive or too much of a pain. But we looked at the data, and who do you think, when you have the model, which nearly all of us have had historically, including Foothill, where students have to raise their hand to get student services, like there's no kind of structured support, who do you think uses student services? Already motivated. You know what the average GPA of students who use student services at Foothill was? 3.7. We help B+ students become A- students. We help A- students become A students. That is what you get when you have a model where students have to raise their hand to get support. Or you serve 0.0 students who may or may not have any chance by the point we serve them when they go on probation, right? So one of our issues is, and again, did we do anything wrong? Are we trying to only serve those students? No, but if we have the model where we have to raise your hand to get support, that's who we serve. And by the way, it tends not to be underrepresented student populations, right? So you got a huge equity issue here. At Foothill, this was one of those famous things. We had a huge international program, huge meaning it was 300 or 400 students. No, sorry, 1,000 students, which was 7% of our overall enrollment. They used about 40% of student services. And so you talk about a public press issue there, where you don't have funding, and all of a sudden you're finding out your student services serve international students rather than your own. You got a pretty big issue, right? So we have this issue with who do student services serve. Some other lost points. Okay, here's the big one. So there's two of these, which I see as more important than the others, and it's partially because one of them's my pet peeve, one of them's Davis Jenkins' pet peeve. Pet project, not peeve. This is Davis's, unstructured program and too many choices, and this one's mine. Progress not monitored and feedback not given. So let's go to unstructured programs, too many choices. How many programs do you have? How many degree programs do you have here at Gaston? 60, 70, 80, somewhere in there. How do students currently make a choice between those programs? 41? That's low. Wow. It's more focused than most. That's just and certificate. Throw in certificates too. Now we're over 100, right? Now we're over 100. Okay, degrees and certificates over 100. How do students currently make choices between those programs? Right, they just throw a dart on a board and some. It's actually, by the way, and as we know, the financial aid regs just changed, where they have to pick a program now. So now you got this other issue, which is theoretically a good thing, right? Oh, well, at least they're going to pick a program. But we might ask ourselves what they're using to pick the program. What's the one piece of information that we, colleges in general, Gaston specifically, what's the one thing we give all students that tells them about that choice? It's only one thing. You got it, the catalog. It is the one piece that and again, we don't even print them much anymore. I'm not arguing for printing all the catalogs for everyone, but the catalog's the one place where we at least list all the programs. You ever looked at that section of the catalog and read it from start to end? Yes, well, who's the curriculum chair? That's you, right? Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. Aside from you, and by the way, was that a fun experience?